The sun in early spring didn't warm much in the high country east of Silver Vein Ridge. It just glared, low, white and cold as bone. Snow still clung in patches across the rock faces like moth-eaten shrouds, and the wind carried a biting edge even as the desert floor below stirred with dust and distant gunfire. Somewhere beneath that same sky stood a little nothing town called Perdition Bluff, too dry for farming and too played out for gold, yet just stubborn enough to keep breathing. Folks here didn't live, they endured. At the northern edge of town, just past the split-rail fence and rusted water tower, stood a house with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged like the back of an old mule. It had seen better decades, back when it was built by a man named Everett Callahan, who'd brought his young bride west to carve out a life with bare hands and borrowed money. That woman, now 52, stood alone on that porch, shawl pulled tight against the morning wind, her silver hair braided neat like she still had pride left in her. Her name was Clara Callahan, but most just called her the widow. Folks in town said she'd been soft once, sweet like pie, full of laughter and charity. But the land hardens everyone, and Clara was no exception. First came the fire that took her barn, then the fever that took her only child, then the accident in the ravine that snapped Everett's spine and left her a widow by 34. After that, she closed up the church pantry she used to run, sold off the livestock, and turned cold as iron left out in a snowstorm. She didn't look for comfort, didn't beg for help, and sure as hell didn't care what people whispered behind her back. That was 15 years ago. Now she kept to herself, raised hens, and traded eggs at the general store once a week. There were no visitors, no kin. Just silence, creaking wood, and the occasional crow bold enough to perch on her roof. But one morning, the morning this story truly begins, Clara heard a sound she hadn't heard in years, a gunshot echoing too close, followed by the frantic thunder of hooves and the rattling approach of something, or someone, in trouble. She stepped off the porch, boots crunching gravel, and squinted into the sun. Down the road came a horse, rider slumped forward. The animal was lathered and breathing hard, its flanks streaked with dust and sweat. As it drew closer, Clara saw blood on the saddle, then on the rider's leg, soaked through the boot. The man wasn't old. Late 20s maybe. He had Apache in him, she thought, or Mexican, but his face was sunburnt and raw from days without shelter. He fell off before she could say a word. She cursed, dropped to her knees beside him. His shirt was torn, riddled with buckshot. Not fresh, but not healed either. The kind of wound a man got when someone wanted him to die slow. He muttered something in Spanish before going limp. Clara looked around. Nothing but dust and silence. She should have left him there. That would have been the safe thing. She didn't need trouble, didn't want it. But she couldn't shake the look in his eyes just before he passed out. There was fear, yes, but something else. Defiance. He looked like a man who'd survived too much to die in the dirt of some stranger's land. She sighed, stood, and dragged him inside. It took everything she had to heave him onto the old sofa and cut the shirt from his chest. The wounds were angry and red, but not yet rotted. She boiled water, found the whiskey, and stitched him up with trembling hands. Every now and then he'd stir, but he didn't wake. She spoke to him anyway. "Don't get the wrong idea," she muttered. "You die on my floor, I'm burying you face down." 3 days passed before he opened his eyes. She was sweeping when she heard the whisper behind her. Just one word. "Water." She turned, found him half-sitting, drenched in sweat. She brought a cup, held it to his lips. He drank slow, like every swallow hurt. "You got a name?" she asked. He looked at her, like weighing the question might kill him. "Mateo," he said. Clara nodded. "Well, Mateo, you're lucky I was feelin' stupid that morning." He tried to smile. Didn't quite manage it. "Why'd you help me?" Clara didn't answer right away. She stared out the window, past the frost-glazed glass to where the ridge met the horizon. After a long pause, she said, "A long time ago, someone did the same for me. And I was too proud to thank them. Figured maybe this was the time to balance it out." Mateo closed his eyes again. Clara watched him for a while, then went back to her chores. She didn't know then that the man bleeding on her couch was worth a bounty, one high enough to tempt every drunk, liar, and broken soul in town. She didn't know he was hunted not just by mercenaries, but by men who once called him brother. And she sure as hell didn't know that by choosing to save him, she'd just declared war on Perdition Bluff. But maybe, somewhere beneath that weathered, grieving shell, she didn't care. Because for the first time in a decade, Clara Callahan had done something not out of survival, but out of defiance. And that, more than any bullet or blade, would be what set this whole thing ablaze. The town of Perdition Bluff didn't miss much. Especially not strangers, and especially not when those strangers bleed all over the floorboards of the widow Callahan's house. It started quiet, like most trouble does. A question here, a sideways glance there. A saddle hand named Greeley claimed he'd seen a wounded rider headed north of town the week before. A boy at the mercantile mentioned seeing Clara buying extra whiskey and salt, more than any widow needed. Then the banker's wife, old Mrs. Whitcomb, swore she saw smoke coming from Clara's chimney in the middle of the night. Folks don't keep fires past dark unless they got something, or someone, worth hiding. By the seventh day, suspicion had taken root. And in Perdition Bluff, suspicion was just a slower word for judgment. Inside the house, Mateo's fever broke. He could sit up now, drink on his own, and move a little, though his legs still throbbed like it had a snake coiled around the bone. Clara kept her distance most days, busying herself with chickens and fence repairs. She didn't ask questions, and he didn't offer answers. But something had shifted between them, like two stray dogs learning not to bark in each other's presence. On the 9th morning, Clara returned from town later than usual. Her jaw was tight, hands shaking just enough to spill a tin of coffee grounds across the table. Mateo, watching from the sofa, didn't speak. He just waited. "They know," she said finally. "Not everything, but enough to start sniffing around." Mateo nodded slowly. "Then I should go." Clara looked at him, really looked. The way a person does when they're trying to see past the edges of their own stubbornness. "You can't ride yet," she said. "Not far. Not fast." "I'll crawl if I have to," he replied. Clara crossed her arms, lips thin. "That'd just lead him straight to your grave." He didn't argue. He didn't have the strength. That afternoon, a man came calling. Jeb Thornton, town councilman, rancher, and a man who smelled power the way coyotes smell blood. He rode up with two others, rifles slung lazy across their saddles. Clara met them on the porch, hands empty, eyes sharp. "Afternoon, widow," Jeb said, tipping his hat. "Heard you been under the weather." "I'm fine," she said. "What do you want, Jeb?" He smiled in that oily, patronizing way that made her want to reach for the shotgun just inside the door. "Oh, just making rounds," he said. "There's talk of outlaws headed through these parts. Dangerous sort. Got a price on their heads, too. Thought maybe I'd remind good folks to keep their doors locked and eyes open." Clara didn't flinch. "My eyes work fine." One of the riders behind him, a younger man with a scar over one cheek, spat into the dirt. "We'll be patrolling a bit," Jeb added. "Just to keep folks safe." She nodded once. "Long as you don't forget which side of the fence you're supposed to be on." They rode off without another word, but the message was clear. They weren't looking for an outlaw. They were looking for an excuse. That night, Mateo tried to stand without help and nearly collapsed. Clara caught him under the arms and eased him back down. "You've got about 3 days," she said. "Then they'll stop knocking and start breaking things." He leaned back against the wall, breathing hard. "They really think I'm worth that much? You tell me." He looked away. After a long silence, he spoke. "My name's not really Mateo," he said. "It's Tomas Esquivel. My father was Apache, my mother Mexican. I worked the freight trails east of here, drove wagons, carried post. I knew every canyon and draw by heart. One day, a gang out of Dry Lake offered me coin to guide them through the sandstone narrows. Said they needed to avoid patrols. I didn't ask questions." Clara listened, unmoving. "They ambushed a payroll wagon. Killed 3 soldiers. Left the 4th alive. But barely. When the law came sniffing, the gang vanished. I was the only one they could find. And I had their blood on my boots." "You didn't kill those men?" Claire asked. "No," Tomas said. "But I helped them all the same. Ignorance don't buy forgiveness. She stared at him for a long while. Then quietly she said, "Neither does silence." The next morning, Clara rode into town before dawn, alone. She went to the blacksmith, then the general store, then the telegraph office. She didn't smile. Didn't make small talk. Just handled her business like a woman with no time left to waste. That evening, just before sundown, Sheriff Harlan came by. He wasn't like the others, younger, quieter. Honest, some said, though not many trusted a man who still polished his boots in a town full of dust. Clara met him at the fence. "I don't like this," he said. "You harboring someone makes this town nervous." "Let him be nervous," she said. "You've lived here a long time, Clara. Folks used to look up to you. Used to say you had the Lord's ear." She looked past him, toward the jagged peaks in the distance. "The Lord's been awful quiet these last 15 years. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. This man, if he's who they say he is, he's dangerous. He'll bring more than Thornton sniffing around. He'll bring war." Clara met his gaze. "Then let it come." That night, someone fired a shot through her window. The bullet missed Tomas by inches. Clara patched the glass and didn't say a word. On the second day, someone poisoned her chickens. She buried them behind the shed, hands trembling not from fear, but from fury. And on the third day, just after dusk, 4 riders appeared on the ridge above her land. They didn't come close. Just sat on their horses, watching. Tomas stood beside her on the porch, leaning heavy on a crutch he'd fashioned from a broken fence post. "They'll be back," he said. "I know. You should have let me die in the dirt." Clara didn't reply. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small iron key. "What's this?" he asked. "There's a shack 3 miles west. Near the old rail spur. Inside's a crate with dynamite. Everett kept it for rattlesnakes and coyotes. Thought maybe someday he'd blow up the ridge to find more gold." She looked at him, eyes cold as steel. "You want to leave. But if you stay, if you fight, we do it my way." Tomas stared at her, the wind tugging at his shirt, the sky darkening above them like a loaded gun. And for the first time since he'd arrived, he smiled. The attack came just before first light. Tomas had been right. They came quiet, low to the ground, assuming their quarry would be too old, too slow, or too stupid to see it coming. But they hadn't counted on the widow being awake 3 hours earlier, soaking rope in kerosene. Hadn't expected the front porch to be rigged with glass jars of tallow oil stacked like firewood under the steps. Hadn't imagined a half-crippled man with Apache blood and a rusted trigger finger would be crouched in the cellar with a line of sight through a cracked hatch. At 5:18 a.m., the first foot hit the porch. And Clara Callahan lit the fuse. The explosion wasn't grand. This wasn't some theatrical affair of cannonballs and war drums. Just a thump and a roar, fast and sudden, the wood snapping upward like a gator's mouth, followed by a human scream that stopped just as fast. Fire tore up the planks, and with it, confusion spread among the raiders like disease. Shouts echoed. Horses panicked. One man dropped his rifle and staggered back into a cactus patch, howling as the needles ripped his side. From her bedroom window, Clara picked off 2 with a Remington rifle that hadn't been fired since Everett died. The first took a round through the gut. He fell hard and cried for his mother. The second caught it in the shoulder and fled. She didn't aim for the kill. Not yet. The goal wasn't to slaughter, just to scare the hell out of them. Tomas, from below, took out a third man's knee. By the time the smoke cleared, 4 were down and the rest scattered like hogs through a cornfield. They left behind a hat, a bloody boot, and more importantly, a message. The widow Callahan was not a soft target. For the next 3 days, no one came near the house. No gunshots. No riders. Just wind, silence, and the slow creak of the weather vanes spinning in the heat. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. And for Tomas and Clara, something else had shifted. On the second night after the attack, they sat by lamplight in the kitchen. The table between them held a half bottle of rye and 2 tin mugs. Tomas had removed the bandage on his leg and managed to limp without wincing. His face was leaner now, sharper. The fugitive who had once slumped in her doorway like a dying animal had been replaced by something more focused. "You knew what you were doing," he said, nodding toward the wreckage of the porch. Clara sipped her drink. I listen better than I talk. He chuckled. I owe you more than thanks. You don't owe me anything, she said flatly. Still, he said, I want to repay it. She glanced up. Her voice softened, barely. Then tell me who you really are. He paused, then leaned forward. My full name's Tomas Mateo Esquivel. My father fought in the Chiricahua campaigns. Taught me to track, to ride, to live on less than the desert gives. My mother cleaned church floors until her hands bled. I ran freight for a man named Hobb in the red wash trade, legit work until it wasn't. They used my routes to move contraband. I turned a blind eye until soldiers died. His voice dropped. I didn't fire the gun that killed them, but I didn't stop it either. Clara stared at him. Do you regret it? Every time I close my eyes. That hung in the air a moment. She leaned back, arms folded. Then you've still got a soul. That's worth something in Perdition Bluff. The days crawled by after that. The heat rose. Buzzards returned. The town stayed quiet, but not still. In town, whispers grew into rumors. Some claimed the widow had taken the outlaw to bed. Others insisted she was guarding hidden gold. Someone said they'd seen Tomas bathing at the stream and swore he had Apache war paint on his arms. Hysteria and curiosity mixed like sour whiskey. And with it came pressure. The sheriff stopped by again. You've made your point, he said, tipping his hat with unease. But Jeb's not done. He's hired outside help, 4 men from Canyon Hollow. Mean types. Bounty chasers who don't ask questions. Clara looked past him. Then maybe I'll stop asking them too. He gave her one last chance. One last way out. But she didn't take it. Instead, she built a second fire pit out back, where Tomas began forging his own bullets. She cleaned the spring house for emergency supplies. Every hour was preparation, not just for a fight, but for survival afterward. But it wasn't all grit and steel. One afternoon, Clara found Tomas outside, planting onions in a half-rotted box near the fence line. Didn't take you for a farmer, she said. He looked up, smiling faintly. I'm not. But you had seeds in the shed, and the soil's not dead. Figured something ought to live here. That night he cooked nothing fancy, cornbread, beans, a little rabbit he'd caught with a snare. They sat in silence, listening to the coyotes call out over the ridge. I used to think I'd die in a place like this, Tomas said. Alone. Under stars. Buried in dust. You still might, Claire replied, dry as bone. He laughed, genuinely this time. Yeah. But now it don't feel like such a waste. Her face didn't soften, but her voice did. You want to live, you better stop thinking like a man half dead already. Later that evening he gave her a gift, a crude bracelet made of string and a bone button from one of her old coats. For luck, he said. My mother believed in charms. She didn't take it at first. But when he left it on the windowsill, she didn't throw it away. The next morning she was wearing it. But peace, like a summer rain, never lasted long in Perdition Bluff. That same day, a stranger walked into the general store. Broad-shouldered, cold, saddle-worn. He didn't give a name, just left a silver dollar on the counter and asked one question. Where's the widow? That evening, Clara saw the first of them from the ridge. 4 riders. Dressed in dusters. Faces hidden beneath wide brims. Their horses drank from her stream like they'd already claimed the land. She and Tomas watched from the cellar hatch. They're scouts, he whispered. Tomorrow comes the rest. Clara's jaw tightened. Well then, she said, let's not let the bastards sleep easy. They had 1 night left, maybe 2 if the weather turned. But it was enough. Enough to prepare. Enough to fight. Enough, perhaps, for something more than survival. The storm came before the fight did. Not of guns or men, but thunder. A slow-bellied rumble that rolled in from the south like something ancient had stirred. Clouds gathered thick as wet wool, the sky turning the color of old bruise. Rain hadn't touched Perdition Bluff in nearly 6 months. Now it came down hard, all at once, slicing across the land like God had poured out his last patience. The riders disappeared from the ridge as the downpour hit. Clara knew they hadn't retreated, only delayed. The mud would slow them too, force them to wait. A blessing she didn't ask for, but wasn't fool enough to ignore. She and Tomas used the time. They patched the leaky corners of the barn, filled barrels with rainwater, sealed the windows with flour sacks soaked in wax. Tomas, though still limping, moved better now, faster, more sure-footed. Whatever poison had been in his blood was long gone. His hands had calluses again. The kind you only earn from doing more than surviving. That night, with the rain pounding like hooves on the roof, they didn't talk of ambushes or escape. Instead, they sat together in the kitchen with a single lantern lit and let the quiet settle over them like a blanket. Clara boiled potatoes. Tomas carved wood. And something unnamed stretched between them. Not a rope, not a chain, but something looser. A thread, maybe? Soft, quiet. After the meal, Tomas stood and limped over to the old sideboard. There was a dusty phonograph there, long and used. He ran a finger along the grooves of its frame and looked back at her. This thing work? Clara arched a brow. You planning to dance, outlaw? He smiled. If I did, I'd step on your toes. She walked over anyway, opened the cabinet, and pulled out a record, Missouri Waltz, scratched but playable. She cranked the handle, dropped the needle, and after a moment of crackling static, the music began. Neither of them moved at first. They just stood there in that cramped kitchen, the rain and waltz weaving together like an old dream half-remembered. Then Tomas extended a hand. Clara hesitated. Her hands were rough, not from delicate things like silk or sewing, but from years of digging, splitting wood, burying animals. She hadn't danced since her wedding. Her feet had forgotten. But her heart remembered. So she took his hand and he pulled her in slow. They didn't speak, didn't smile. Just moved, a shuffle, a sway, the gentle rock of bodies that had forgotten touch. His hand at her waist, hers on his shoulder. They moved like ghosts, but for once they weren't haunted. They were simply there. Together. Alive. When the song ended, they didn't let go right away. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was full. Like something had been said without words. Tomas broke it first. Your boy, he said quietly. You never talk about him. Clara didn't pull away. His name was Elijah. He was 10 when the fever came. I buried him under the old cottonwood behind the barn. She paused, then added softer. He had Everett's smile. Never stopped asking why things were the way they were. Tomas nodded. I would have liked him. She met his eyes. He would have asked about your scar. He touched the faint line above his cheekbone. And I'd have told him the truth. Silence again. Then Tomas said, You ever think of leaving this place? She looked around, at the peeling wallpaper, the cracked window glass, the roof that still leaked even after 3 coats of tar. Sometimes, she said. But it's mine. All that's left of Everett. Of Elijah. Of who I was. And now. Clara looked out at the storm. Now I don't know who I am. He didn't press her. Just stood beside her, watching the rain slide down the glass. Later, they sat on the floor near the stove, wrapped in blankets and listening to the hiss of the fire. Clara stitched a tear in Tomas's shirt. He sharpened her kitchen knives. Neither said much. But something had softened in her. The hard edges, the steel and grit, had bent just a little. Not broken. Not melted. But warmed. She made soup that night. Simple, beans, wild sage, and a little salt pork. When he tasted it, Tomas froze. This tastes like home, he said. Clara didn't look up. My mother made it on Sundays. After the Lord's Day walk and before my father passed out drunk. He blinked. Still made you feel safe? She shrugged. Safe enough. He didn't say it, but the warmth in his eyes said he understood. That night as they slept, her on the cot by the kitchen, him on the sofa by the window, the storm finally passed. The air smelled of wet earth and distant cedar. The land, for all its cruelty, had forgiven them for one night. But forgiveness doesn't last forever. At sunrise, Clara stepped onto the porch. Tracks. Boot prints. Deep, deliberate. The kind left by a man who wasn't hiding anymore. They were back. She didn't call Tomas. Just stood there, the wind tugging at her shawl, her breath fogging the morning chill. Behind her, Tomas appeared quietly. "They're sending a message," he said. She nodded. "We send one back." He turned to go, but she caught his hand. "Tomas." He stopped. "Look back." She didn't speak. Just held his hand for a long moment, her fingers closing around his like someone reaching for the edge of a cliff. He squeezed back, not hard, not possessive. Just enough to say, "I'm here." And in that second, not in a kiss, not in a confession, but in a glance shared beneath a worn porch roof, they made something close to a promise. Not of forever, just of now. And in Perdition Bluff, that was enough. They came with fire. No warning. No letters nailed to the gate. Just the sudden glow on the northern ridge, a ring of torchlight like the mouth of hell yawning open at sundown. Clara saw it first. She'd been hauling feed from the barn when the flicker caught her eye. The torches moved in formation, 4 across, 2 behind, and 1 in front who rode without a hat and carried something in his hand. A rope. Already tied. "Jeb Thornton," she muttered. Tomas was on the porch oiling the rifle she'd left for him. When she nodded to the ridge, he didn't ask questions. He just stood, checked the chamber and said, "We ready?" "No," she said. "But that's never stopped us before." The riders didn't come straight for the house. They circled again, slow, wide, like wolves testing the fence line. But this time, they didn't hide. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to be feared. By dusk, Perdition Bluff had gathered near the Callahan fence. Townsfolk stood in clumps, storekeepers, ranch hands, housewives with aprons still tied at their waists. Some carried rifles. Most just carried eyes full of fear. They hadn't come to fight. They'd come to watch. Sheriff Harlan wasn't among them. Clara wasn't surprised. Thornton rode up first. His horse was a massive bay with eyes like coals. His coat was new, black leather with silver buttons, but his face looked old, heavy with ambition and rot. He pulled the horse to a stop just beyond the fence and let the silence stretch. "Evenin', widow," he called. "I'd hoped you'd have more sense than this." Clara stepped forward. She wore Everett's duster, buttoned to the collar, and her shotgun rested against her hip like it had grown there. "You came to my land with fire," she said. "You best be ready to meet what waits in it." A few of the townsfolk shifted uneasily. Thornton laughed. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Give us the boy. You walk free. You've got enough grief on your back. Why carry someone else's?" Clara looked to Tomas, who stood by the barn door, his fingers wrapped tight around the rifle. Then she turned back. "If he's a criminal, take it up with the law," she said. "You ain't the law, Jeb." He leaned in the saddle. "The law's too yellow to finish what needs finishing. So I brought men who ain't." The riders behind him moved forward, rifles drawn. The man on the far left, the one with the scar through his eye, dismounted and started walking toward the gate. Clara raised the shotgun. "One more step and you'll spend Sunday without a spine." The man stopped. Tomas stepped into view. The town gasped. The outlaw. He was taller now, standing straight. Pale from blood loss, but steady. He walked toward Clara, not hiding. Not flinching. He spoke loud and clear. "My name is Tomas Mateo Esquivel. I ran freight. I was lied to. I guided men who killed others. I did not kill. But I didn't stop it either." A beat of silence. "I've carried the guilt. I've bled for it. I've been hunted, starved, and damned." Then, looking directly at Thornton, he added, "But I won't run anymore." Thornton sneered. "You think some confession saves you?" Tomas shook his head. "No. But it gives me the right to fight." Clara's voice was steel. "And it gives me the right to stand with him." Thornton's face darkened. He lifted the rope. "This is justice." "No," she said. "This is cowardice and you're hiding behind it." The moment cracked like glass. A gun fired. Clara flinched. Tomas ducked. But the shot hadn't come from the house. It had come from the crowd. A puff of smoke rose from the preacher's son, a boy no older than 16, who stood, pale-faced, holding a revolver that shook in both hands. "I missed," he muttered. The crowd turned to him in horror. But it was enough. Enough for panic. Enough for Thornton to shout, Take them. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a stampede of chaos. 3 riders surged forward. Clara fired, 1 dropped. Tomas wheeled left and pulled the trigger. Another screamed, blood soaking his thigh. The 3rd made it to the porch. Claire met him there. He raised his rifle, but she was faster. Barrel to gut, pulled the trigger. He fell. Then came the smoke. Someone had set the barn alight. Tomas turned, eyes wide. The horses. He ran for them, coughing through the flames. Clara moved to follow, but a hand grabbed her from behind, slammed her to the ground. Thornton. He straddled her, knife drawn, eyes wild. You ruin everything, he hissed. She fought, scratched, kicked. But he was stronger. I gave you a chance, widow. I offered you freedom. She spat blood. I already had it. You just never saw. The knife rose. And then a shot. Thornton froze. The second shot, then another. He slumped sideways, dead before he hit the ground. Behind him stood Sheriff Harlan. Hat off. Face pale. Gun in hand. I'm late, he said. Clara nodded, coughing. You showed. The sheriff looked to the burning barn, to Tomas limping out, 2 horses stumbling behind him. It's over, he said. But it wasn't. Not quite. From the crowd, Willa Whitcomb, the banker's wife, stepped forward. You protect a killer, she shouted. You've betrayed this town. Clara stood, blood dripping from her temple. No. I saved it. From turning into something uglier than any man we've hunted. Silence. Tomas moved beside her, bleeding again. She held him up. If you think I'm wrong, she told the crowd, shoot us. But do it with your eyes open. The preacher's son lowered his gun. One by one, others turned away. Willa spat in the dust, but said nothing more. The sheriff holstered his weapon. You'll need to leave, he said. Clara nodded. We will. By midnight, the fire was out. The barn was gone. Thornton's body was covered in canvas. And the crowd had dispersed, quiet and ashamed. Inside the house, Clara sat on the floor beside Tomas. She dressed his wound with a steady hand. He watched her in silence, then said softly, I'm sorry. She didn't answer. But when she finished the bandage, she leaned her forehead against his. And whispered, so am I. The dawn came gray and slow. Not golden, not triumphant, just quiet. Like the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. Smoke curled from the still smoldering barn, drifting eastward where the wind ran gentler. Most of the crowd had gone. A few lingered near the bluff's edge, silent figures watching as if expecting a resurrection that wouldn't come. Inside the house, Clara folded the last of Everett's shirts and placed it in a wooden chest beside the bed. It had taken all night to sort what to leave behind and what to carry. Some things she couldn't bring herself to part with. Others were easy, the cracked plates, the broken lamp by the stairs, the dreams that had no place beyond these dry walls. Tomas sat on the porch, wrapped in one of her shawls, watching the road. His wounds would heal, slowly. The bullet had grazed muscle and left a purple welt on his side, but nothing vital. What wouldn't heal as fast were the memories, of gunfire, of faces twisted in hate, of fire swallowing all he and Clara had built in quiet defiance. When she stepped out, she carried the chest, her old carpet bag, and a small tin of tobacco he hadn't asked for but always glanced at. He looked up at her. You sure? He asked. No, she said. But I'm done waiting to be. They didn't speak again for a long while. He stood, took the bags, and loaded them onto the only horse that remained strong enough to carry 2. She turned once to look at the house. The porch. The stairs. Elijah had tumbled down laughing. The dent in the doorframe where Everett had banged his hammer in frustration. The spot by the stove where she'd once cried into a pan of burned cornbread and whispered prayers she didn't believe would reach heaven. All of it was hers. And none of it held her anymore. She whispered, goodbye. And the land whispered back with wind. They rode out slow, passing the graves by the cottonwood, Everett's and Elijah's. She laid a sprig of sage on each and didn't cry. She didn't have to. They were with her now, always. At the edge of town, the sheriff met them. He dipped his hat. Where to? Tomas answered, north. Maybe Colorado. Heard there's work, quiet valleys, space to breathe. Clara added, and fewer men with ropes and old grudges. The sheriff chuckled, but it was a tired sound. I'll say this, you gave this town a piece of its spine back. Even if it don't know it yet. Clara met his eyes. You did too. He nodded once, then turned and let them pass. As they left Perdition Bluff behind, a few heads turned to watch. Willa Whitcomb scowled from her porch. The preacher's boy gave a shy wave. Clara didn't wave back, but she touched the brim of her hat. That was enough. By midday they had reached the edge of the flats. Grass rolled out like an endless tide. The road was barely a path now, more memory than trail. They stopped beneath a cluster of junipers. Tomas slid down first, then helped her dismount. They shared water from a canteen, bread from her satchel, and silence thick with meaning. Finally, Tomas broke it. Do you regret it? Staying. Fighting. She looked at him. I regret waiting so long to live again. He nodded, slowly. I was dead when you found me. She smiled, faint and crooked. You weren't the only one. He took her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. They made camp in a shallow grove that night. No fire. Just stars above, blinking like old secrets. Coyotes howled in the distance. A lark sang once, then fell silent. Clara curled beneath her blanket, staring up. You think they'll remember me? She asked. Tomas answered without hesitation. They'll remember the woman who stood when others folded. Who didn't just keep a house, but held a line. Clara turned toward him. That's not who I was. It's who you became. The pause. Then she asked the question she hadn't dared voice until now. And what are we now, Tomas? He didn't answer right away. But after a moment, he leaned forward, brushed a strand of gray from her face, and whispered, whatever we want to be. That night, she dreamed not of Everett or Elijah, but of rivers. Wide, rushing. Unmapped. She walked barefoot in the shallows, sun on her shoulders, and a hand in hers. A week later, in a small town nestled between two cedar hills, a woman and a man rode in under the morning fog. They didn't give their real names. Said they were cousins, folks traveling west in search of work and weather that didn't bite your bones. The woman bought a small cabin near the edge of town, overlooking a stream. She started a garden. Sold herbs. Helped birth 2 colts and 3 babies that fall. The man found work at the stables. Never said much. But when someone got drunk and rowdy, he stood taller than most and stared trouble back into its bottle. No one asked questions. Sometimes, the woman stood on her porch at sunset and watched the hills. Waiting for something, maybe ghosts, maybe memories. But what came instead was peace. And sometimes, love. Not the burning kind. Not the all-devouring, wild, breathless thing of stories. But the slow kind. The kind that grows from shared silence and firewood stacked together. The kind that says, I know who you've been, and I still choose you. And once, when a stranger passed through and mentioned Perdition Bluff, the woman smiled softly and said, I used to live there. The stranger nodded. Heard it was a hard place. She looked out across the stream, wind tugging at her shawl. It was, she said. But sometimes hard places are where the heart remembers how to beat.